In the last video, I asked people what they would trade in to win championships, or if you would trade in championships to have better stats, accolades, or film. We learned that Pro Bowls and All-Star teams are usually the first things to get traded in. We also learned that if your legacy will be enhanced by trading something in, be it stats or a championship, then you make the trade. In this video, we are going to be talking about the role that championships play in player rankings. What I did was ask people to give me who they thought were the top 5 or 10 players in the history of their favorite team. Most of the people met me in the middle with 7 or 8. After they gave me their rankings, I took things away or added some things to see what effect it would have on where a player would end up ranking. If a player won championships, I asked people if that player would have been ranked lower if they didn't have those championships. And then I asked them if that same player didn't win those championships but had better stats, accolades, or film, if they would be ranked higher, lower, or stay where they are. If a player did not win a championship, I asked people if that player had won a championship, would they have been ranked higher? And then I asked them if that same player did win a championship but had worse stats, accolades, or film, if they would have been ranked higher, lower, or stay where they are. In the first video on this topic, I was trying to talk to both the people that seem to argue only with championships and the people that say championships shouldn't be used in player rankings. However, this video is mostly intended for the people that say championships should not be used in player rankings because whether you like it or not, championships do matter, and they should play a role in where you rank a player. So with all that explained, let's begin. We're going to start off with hockey. The only person that answered this portion was Kyle. His favorite hockey team is the Bruins, and his top 7 Bruins were Bobby Orr, Phil Esposito, Patrice Bergeron, Ray Bourque, Cam Neely, Zdeno Chara, and Brad Marchand. If you see an asterisk next to a player, then that means they won a Stanley Cup as a Bruin. Bourque did win a Stanley Cup with Colorado, but not as a Bruin, and Kyle told me he did his rankings based on what the players did as a member of the Boston Bruins. For the first question I asked Kyle, I was specifically asking him about Cam Neely and Ray Bourque since neither of them won a championship for the Bruins. If either of those two players would have won a championship with the Bruins, would they have been ranked higher? Kyle told me he would bump Bourque up from number 4 to number 2, but he felt Neely was good where he was at number 5. Since Bourque was the player that Kyle said he would bump up, I asked him, what if Bourque had worse stuff? Would he be ranked higher, lower, or would he stay in the same spot? In hindsight, I probably would have reworded this question not just on this slide, but on the others, to how much could said player have lost while still making you move said player up. But Kyle told me, if Bourque's production stayed at a high level, and he lost 2 Norris trophies and a Calder trophy, he said he thinks he would still move Bourque up. Kyle specifically said, I do think that would be enough to still say he's an absolute legend. Now, when asking about players that did win championships, I specifically asked him about Chara and Marchand. If either of those 3 players did not win any Stanley Cups, would they have been ranked lower? Kyle told me that Chara and Orr's numbers were insane, and their impact was insane.
I think the biggest argument is Marchand. Just because, even if you look at Chara and Orr, like their numbers are still insane and their impact for the Bruins was still insane. It just came down to, that they also won championships. I think Marchand's probably, and I'm biased because the 2011 Bruins are still a big deal for me. That Marchand being able to win that cup, I think meant a lot to me too. And, being such a big impact player, I think he scored a goal in that game 7 too against the Vancouver Canucks to win that cup. So I think that goes a long way. I think he'd be one of those guys that's like, he's a great player, but not an all-time great kind of thing. And maybe if he doesn't have a championship, someone like Johnny Busick would probably go up in my on my rankings.
What I interpreted from Kyle's answer is that Chara and Orr would probably be unaffected by the loss of championships. With Orr in particular, he was so great that the Stanley Cups are just the cherry on top of an unbelievable career. Kyle mentioned that Marchand was a great, but not an all-time great. So Marchand's Stanley Cup is holding a lot of weight for Kyle. Kyle mentions that the 2011 Bruins are a big deal for him. For those that don't know, 2011 was the first time the Bruins won a Stanley Cup since 1970. So you can see why Kyle would want to put Marchand on the list, even if there might have been better players. Like I've briefly mentioned in this little video series, not all championships are equal, and some championships feel like they're worth more than one. Kyle said that Marchand would go down if he didn't have the Stanley Cup. So what if we replaced the Stanley Cup with better accolades, stats, or film? Again, in hindsight, I probably would have reworded this question to something like, how much better of stuff would said player have needed to have to negate the loss of a championship? But even with adding to Marchand's resume, Kyle still said that he would probably rank Marchand lower. I also asked people to give me their top 5 to 10 players in the history of their favorite team for basketball and football. And we're going to go over basketball first. I got 6 responses in this section. Everyone that answered this question was a Detroit Pistons fan. If I asked people this question tomorrow, they might give me a different list. But these are the names they gave me for this conversation. If a name is written in yellow, that means that player won one or more championships. I'm not going to read everyone's list off. I'll let you, the viewer, pause the video to read the list if you want to, but I do want to note some things. Isaiah Thomas was everyone's number 1. Ben Wallace was ranked in various places, but he made everybody's list. Other names that made 4 out of 6 of the lists were Joe Dumars, Chauncey Billups, Bill Laimbeer, Grant Hill, and Richard Hamilton. Dave Bing and Bob Lanier made 3 lists. And then some curveballs I got were Tajon Prince, Rick Mahorn, and John Sally. On this slide, championships clearly had a role in where players ranked. Most of the players that made people's rankings either played for the Bad Boys or they played for the 2004 team. Besides the championships, these players also rank in the top 10 in a lot of Pistons statistics, be it points, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, three-pointers made, field goals made, etc. So obviously championships weren't the only thing that mattered to the people that I interviewed, but to say they did not matter would be absurd. So now we're going to start adding things or taking things away to see how players' rankings would be affected. The first question, of course, is if said player would have won a championship, would you have ranked them higher? If the writing is yellow, that means a player could potentially have moved up. If the writing is green, then that means the interviewee would have definitely moved a player up 1 or more spots. And if the writing is blue, that means the player would have stayed where they are at. I assume you, the viewer, see all the green here. Real from Real Detroit Lions fans said if Grant Hill was destroying people and won a championship, he would go up 1 or 2 spots. Detroit Drew said Dave Bing and Bob Lanier would move up into his top 3. Bravo said Blake Griffin, Bob Lanier, and Grant Hill would definitely rank higher. JMO said Bob Lanier and Dave Bing would 100% have ranked higher if they won a championship for the Pistons. Nomis said Dave Bing would move up, but Grant Hill would stay where he is. I want to go over Hill, Lanier, and Bing. All 3 of these players rank in the top 10 in multiple categories for the Pistons. Hill made people's lists more often than Lanier and Bing did. I can't confirm or deny this hypothesis, but I think part of it is recency bias. Most of the people I interviewed were probably too young to remember a prime Grant Hill, but as far as I know, none of the people I interviewed were alive when Lanier and Bing were playing. Now, with that said, those were the 3 people that I referred to the most often when asking if a player would have ranked higher had they won a championship, and according to the interviewees, they would have moved those 3 up. I want to go back to my recency bias hypothesis. Despite the majority of the people I interviewed not being alive during the Bad Boys era, they still put numerous Bad Boys on their lists, and none of them hesitated to put Isaiah Thomas as the greatest Piston of all time. Despite how great Lanier and Bing were, they only made it onto 3 rankings. We can clearly see that the people that did rank them would have ranked Bing and Lanier higher had they won a championship. So my question now is, would they have made it onto more rankings had they won a championship? The evidence shows yes. Even if the majority of these people weren't even alive to watch those two, it would be hard not to respect that they would have brought a championship to the Pistons whether we saw them play or not. I mean, most of these people weren't alive to watch the Bad Boys, yet they still put Joe Dumars and Isaiah Thomas on their lists. So it's not far-fetched to think that Lanier and Bing could have made all 6 of the rankings I got had they won a championship. So now the question is, if said player would have contributed to a championship but had worse stuff, would he go up, down, or stay in the same spot? With Damone, I referred to Chauncey Billups. Billups already had a championship, so I was asking him if Billups had won another championship but also had worse stats, film, etc., would he go up, down, or stay in the same spot? Damone said if Billups lost one All-Star but had an extra championship, he would move Billups up his list. Real told me Grant Hill would stay in the same spot. Detroit Drew said Lanier and Bing would be around the same spot, and you'll notice that I wrote Bravo's answer in red. If anything is written in red for these next couple of questions, that means that the response was that a player or players would go down in the rankings. So Bravo told me Lanier, Hill, and Griffin would all go down on his rankings if they replaced some of their stuff with a championship. J-Mo said Lanier and Bing would still go up if they won a championship, but also had worse stuff. And he specifically added that Bing was a bad dude. What I interpret from that answer is that Bing was so good that he would have plenty left over if he were to trade any of his abilities or stats away. And then Nomus told me that Grant Hill would stay in the same spot, but Bing could potentially move up. Overall, I got 2 instances of players moving up, 3 of players staying where they are, 1 of a player that could move up, and 1 of players moving down. So what this slide shows us is that while championships are important in player rankings, you need to have the stats and the eye test to validate your championships. Damone said if Billups lost 1 All-Star team but gained a championship, he would move up. 1 All-Star isn't a lot to lose, especially if you're getting a championship in place of it. Like I mentioned earlier, I wish I would have worded this specific question a little better. But let's say Billups cut all of his accomplishments in half for an extra championship. He wouldn't have made it onto anybody's list. But since he was a great player and he had a championship to show for it, he made almost everybody's list. Here's Bravo expanding on that a little bit more.
Actually, it'll go down in my opinion because they're unique players, and if you probably win a championship, it means you're going to take a lot of their talents to give it to the other guys around them, and in that case, it will make them less significant. I don't know. This is how I look at it. Yeah, maybe. I mean, the championship is a championship. It matters a lot, but sometimes you can't be like that. Like Ben Wallace is a defensive player of the year. You can't really take off multiple years of defensive player of the year basically with he already won a championship. So this is how I look at it. You can't just take off multiple talents from Blake Griffin and give it to other guys just to win a championship. That doesn't make him unique in here.
The 2 answers I want to show you and break down are from Detroit Drew and Nomus. Drew brought up Bing's off-the-court impact.
Dave Bing is still to this day such an impactful person to the city of Detroit, rather if it's being the mayor or helping bring awareness to all the social justice issues going on right now. He's bigger than basketball. He's bigger than his time with the Pistons. So that's why he's in the top 10. It's not just because of individual success, but everything he did for the city of Detroit.
The reason why Dumars is ahead of him is because of the executive role, too, and he was on the Bad Boys.
So what you did off the court, field, or ice can certainly factor into where you rank a player. And then Nomus mentions to me that the eye test can't go. We went over it in the first video, the importance of the eye test, and it was especially important for Nomus. A player can replace some stats with a championship, but it's a little bit harder to replace the eye test with a championship. The next question was, if said player did not contribute to a championship, would he have been ranked lower? I assume you, the viewer, noticed the amount of red on this slide. And even the answer that is written in yellow is Billups moving ahead of Thomas. So overall, Damone told me that Joe Dumars and Isaiah Thomas would most likely go down in his rankings. Real told me Billups might move ahead of Isaiah Thomas, but at the same time, Isaiah Thomas was so dominant. Detroit Drew told me Thomas still has a lot of team records, so he would probably stay where he's at number 1, but it would hurt Joe Dumars and Chauncey Billups. Bravo told me Billups, Hamilton, Wallace would all be lower if they did not win a championship. J-Mo told me that Chauncey and Hamilton would go down. He noted that Ben Wallace was a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, so he would probably stay where he's at. And then he said if Dumars did not win a championship, he's definitely going down. Then Nomas told me that he would just keep his list the same had we taken championships away from players. Overall, we had 10 instances of players going down, or 11 if you include Billups possibly moving ahead of Isaiah Thomas, and 3 instances of players staying where they are at. On this slide, we can see that championships carry different weight for different players. Detroit Drew noted that even if Isaiah Thomas was ringless, he still has a lot of team records, and J-Mo noted that Ben Wallace was still a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year. Even Real noted that while he might move Billups ahead of Thomas, it would be hard to do that because Thomas was such a dominant point guard. Thomas's rings definitely played a role in being ranked number 1 for everybody, but the numbers, eye test, and other accolades would probably be good enough for Thomas to be ranked as the number 1 Piston with or without rings. However, when players like Dumars and Billups were brought up, their rings had a lot more influence in where they ranked. Guys like Dumars and Billups are probably just great players, while Isaiah Thomas is an all-time great player. If you look at the players that I was told would go down in the rankings, they didn't have the kind of stats or accolades that Isaiah Thomas had. Now, if said player did not contribute to a championship but had better stuff, would they go up, down, or stay where they are at? The answers were pretty mixed in this portion. Damone on the last question said that Dumars and Thomas would most likely go down if we took away their championships. And even with giving them more things, he still said that they would most likely go down, noting to me that we wouldn't be looking at them the same. Real told me that Dumars and Billups would stay where they are at. Detroit Drew actually gave me a pretty clear path of what Dumars and Billups would need to do to negate the loss of their rings. He told me that Dumars and Billups would need to have jaw-dropping numbers, go to 10-plus All-Star games, be multiple-time first and second team All-NBA, to be either better or equal to where they're at now. And he even told me that if Billups had Isaiah Thomas-like numbers without a championship, he would actually go up in his rankings. Bravo told me that Thomas, Billups, Hamilton, and Ben Wallace would all go down in his rankings if they lost their championship, even with replacing their championship with other things. And then J-Mo gave the opposite answer of what Detroit Drew gave me. He said if Billups was a 20-9 guy, he would go down to 10. Nomas told me that Bing would probably go up, but everyone else would stay the same. I want to go over Damone's answer first. He said even if Thomas and Dumars replaced their championships with more things, he noted to me that we wouldn't be looking at those two the same.
I don't know if they still would have been as appreciated as they were, because like I said, it's because they won on top of like being great players. Like, I mean, Isaiah dropped like 40 on a bad ankle in the finals. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
that's unbelievable.
You know what I mean? It's like that. It's because of like what they had to go through, but they won. They beat Jordan in his prime. They beat Larry in his prime. They beat Magic in their prime. Like, that's the reason why they get as much praise as they do get. If they didn't beat those guys in their prime, like they were losing in the second round, or I don't think we'd be looking at them the same. It's because they got over the hump while beating those all-time great teams with those all-time great players.
The next two answers I want to break down are from Detroit Drew and J-Mo because they told me completely opposite things. Drew and J-Mo obviously value championships, but in this particular situation, Detroit Drew values the numbers more than J-Mo does. Detroit Drew said if Billups had Isaiah Thomas-like numbers without a championship, he would go up, but J-Mo said if Billups was a 20-9 guy, which are basically Isaiah Thomas numbers without a championship, he would push Billups down from 6 to 10. I assume you, the viewer, can see the colors are varied on this slide. So honestly, based on the answers I got to this question, it's kind of hard to draw a conclusion. It definitely hurts to not have a championship, but based on this sample, it's hard to say what a player would need to replace a lost championship. Here are the answers I got to who people thought were the top 5 to 10 players in the history of their favorite football team. If a player is written in yellow, that means that player won a championship. The breakdown of these fan bases are that I had 8 Lions fans, 3 Patriots fans, and 1 Buccaneers fan answer this portion. The players that made every Lions fans list were Calvin Johnson and Barry Sanders. Some other common names that showed up that didn't quite make everyone's list were Stafford, Sue, Bobby Lane, and Night Train Lane. And then some out of left field picks were Darius Slay, Dre Bly, and DeAndre Levy. One thing that I would note about the selections of the Lions fans was that of the players that were on the teams in the 1950s, when the Lions won 3 championships, only 4 times did any of those players show up. And of those 4 times that they did show up, 3 of them were Bobby Lane. Then of the Patriots fans, the players that made it onto all 3 lists were Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, Ty Law, and Richard Seymour. Every player on Hook Cam's list won at least 1 championship, and with Jackson, the only player that didn't win a championship was Leroy Selman. So now let's see how people would have changed their rankings by adding or taking things away from these players. As you can probably see, the answers I got to this question look very similar to how it looked when I asked people to do this with basketball, but with a larger sample size. Even Damone, who said he wouldn't move anybody up with a championship, said it would have been hard to not move Calvin Johnson to number 1. But Rachel told me she would move Calvin Johnson ahead of Barry Sanders if he won a championship with the Lions. J-Mo gave me 3 players that could potentially move ahead of Barry Sanders with a championship. Nomas and Detroit Drew both told me that Johnson and Stafford would move up the rankings, and Nomas even said that he would rank Stafford and Johnson as number 1 together. Luke G gave me a little bit of a different approach, however. He told me he wants to know what the team that won the Super Bowl looks like before he moves players up his rankings. He said Stafford would have moved up if he won a Super Bowl with everything left the same. And when he says that, he's referring to the less than stellar supporting cast he saw for the most part during his time in Detroit. And he said if Calvin Johnson had a 2,000 or 2,500 yard season or somewhere in that range with 15 touchdowns while having John Kitna throwing to him, he said he might move Johnson up in those circumstances. When we go over to the non-Lions fans that answered this question, Kyle told me Morgan would cement himself as the best Patriots receiver ever had he won a Super Bowl. BottomLineView told me that Tippett would surpass Ty Law, and he even told me that if Welker, who was number 7 on his list, won the 2 Super Bowls he played in as a Patriot, he would also surpass Law. Then Jackson told me that Leroy Selman would go up, and Leroy Selman was the only player that Jackson ranked that did not win a Super Bowl. In the first video I did on this, the conclusion I drew was that championships in football have the least value when compared to other sports, with the exception being the quarterback. But even with that in mind, almost everybody that answered this question still said that they would move non-quarterbacks up their rankings had they won a Super Bowl. Whether it was Jackson moving Selman up, Rachel moving Calvin Johnson up, or Kyle moving Stanley Morgan up. Championships are powerful. Of course, they're not the end-all be-all, but to say that they don't carry weight is ridiculous. So now, what if we gave these same players a championship, but those same players weren't as good? The answers I got here were mixed. There's a combination of red, blue, and green. I think one of the reasons is because it wasn't exactly clear what I meant when I said the player would be worse. But even with that, the people that answered this question did give me some pretty clear boundaries of how much players could lose while still moving up the rankings. Real told me if we reduced Calvin Johnson into a Roddy White caliber receiver, which is still really good, then you're not even Calvin Johnson at that point. J-Mo told me if Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson became Billy Sims and Herman Moore, you can't rank them higher. Jackson told me if Leroy Selman lost his all-decade team, then he would be off the list at that point. Damone told me that Barry Sanders could lose 3 first-team All-Pros and still be number 1. Mitch told me that if Tippett lost 15 to 20 of his sacks, he would still go to number 4. And he said if Wes Welker replaced 2 seasons of production with 2 rings, he would also still go up. Andrew told me if Sanders lost 3,000 yards, he would still stay number 1. And then Rachel told me that Calvin Johnson was so good that if he lost 20% of his abilities, he might still hop to number 1. And then Detroit Drew told me that if Stafford lost 5,000 yards and 30 touchdowns, he would still move Stafford up to being the best line of all time. Now, I want to go back to Rachel saying that Johnson could lose 20% and still possibly surpass Barry Sanders. That 20% number actually looks like it could be the cutoff for how much a player could trade in for a championship while still moving up. In the trading video, we talked about how what you trade in versus what you get in return needs to benefit your legacy if you're going to do that. And if you look at what people said about what certain players could lose to still move up, no one appears to have gone past that 20% mark. Andrew was right at the 20% mark, since Barry Sanders had over 15,000 rushing yards in his career. And then BottomLineView saying that Tippett could have lost 15 to 20 sacks. Andre Tippett had 100 career sacks. But BottomLineView might have gone a little too far with Welker in particular, because that's a little more than 20%. So it's not an exact science, of course, but I think it's worth noting that that 20% is probably around the cutoff. So now what if we just strip players of championships? You'll notice that there aren't as many answers on this slide as the last 2 slides. That's because a lot of Lions players that got ranked didn't win a championship for the Lions. So all I could do was ask them, what if a player won a championship? The answer that I want to break down first is from Hook Cam.
The reason why I answered with the old school guys is because there was a culture that was created in New England. And those guys that I gave you, the old school cats, those are the dudes who helped create that culture. Like the New England Patriots aren't the New England Patriots with those guys there. Now, do I think that the rings had a reason for that? Yes, absolutely. But I also think that those players were special players in a much, much different world without social media, without Instagram and Twitter. And, you know, football was football and we didn't care about what the outside world said, you know, maybe whatever's in the newspaper on TV, but we're not, you know, going on our phones and, you know, seeing, you know, BS on Instagram and Twitter. Those dudes helped create that Patriot way. And those dudes helped create that team first mentality where, you know, okay, maybe I'm not getting the reps I want, but I'm helping the team. I'm a role player, stuff like that. That's why those guys are on that list. So if we take the rings away, it kind of defeats the purpose of having them on there. However, if they still create that culture but don't have the rings, then I would probably still put them on there because that's what those guys helped create there. That's why the New England Patriots are the New England Patriots that they are today.
The New England Patriots were not always, well, the New England Patriots. So you can see why these old school players that brought the Patriots their first championships have a special place in Hook Cam's heart. Hook Cam's top 5 Patriots were Brady, Brown, Bruschi, Law, and McGinnis. You can argue that someone like Gronk or Wilfork maybe should have ranked higher, but they didn't start the Patriots. The impact that those 5 players had on making the Patriots into what they are today can't be described. The way Hook Cam views the original Patriots is probably the same way that a lot of the Pistons fans I interviewed felt about the Bad Boys. They created a culture and brought a winning mentality to franchises that hadn't really experienced the kind of success that fans would want to see. I assume that you all noticed that this slide is basically as red as 2 slides ago was green. BottomLineView told me that Brady would go down to 3 if we stripped his rings away. He also told me that Law and Seymour would also go down. However, Gronkowski, he told me, would stay the same. I actually slightly disagree with Mitch that Brady should go down if we stripped his rings away. I think he still has a case to be the number 1 Patriot of all time. I mean, Joe Schmidt and Bobby Lane won championships, yet they hardly made any of the Lions fans' lists. I feel like most Packers fans would rank Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers ahead of Bart Starr, and I also feel like most Dolphins fans would say that Marino is the greatest Dolphin of all time, even though the Dolphins have players with rings. But that's just me. Kyle told me that Seymour would go down a little bit, but he did tell me that Gronkowski and Law would probably stay the same. So he said something similar to BottomLineView with Gronkowski. Since Gronkowski was so dominant, it's kind of hard to move him down. Detroit Drew told me that Bobby Lane wouldn't have even made his list. And J-Mo told me that Bobby Lane would go down. Then Jackson told me that Brooks, Brady, Evans, and David would probably have been ranked lower. And he also told me that being part of a championship team means something a little bit different for him. So like I said earlier, football is probably the sport where championships mean the least, unless you're a quarterback. But the majority of people that answered this question still said that players would go down if we stripped their championships away. What if we stripped these players of their championships but gave them other things now? When I asked these people to do this on the basketball section, the answers were a little more mixed. BottomLineView told me that if Seymour had 80 sacks, he moves up. And he told me that Law would stay the same. Hookcam told me that Brewski, Brown, and Edelman would probably bump up a little bit. And he even added if Edelman was catching 130 balls a year but he didn't win a ring, well, then he was obviously an insane talent. Andrew told me that he would probably keep Lane around the same spot, and he also noted to me that he might have ranked him higher had he actually been able to watch Lane. And Kyle told me if Gronkowski had more full healthy seasons of production, it would be hard to not move him to number 2. And Detroit Drew told me Lane would need 250 touchdowns to negate the loss of his championships. I like J-Mo's answer because he noted that if we stripped Bobby Lane of his championships, then he's just like every Lions great. Because the Lions have had mostly bad teams since their championships during the 1950s, a lot of their Hall of Famers get overlooked. The Lions might not have always had good teams, but they have had good players. And Bobby Lane having those championships kind of separates him from all the other great players the Lions have had. And then Jackson noted to me that because Brady's only been with the Buccaneers for 1 year and he's going into his second year, it's hard to say what he would do with Brady. But he did tell me that Mike Evans and Levante David would be around the same spot. It wasn't as obvious when I asked this question on the basketball section, but when we look at this slide, there could potentially be enough that a player can do to compensate for not winning a championship. In this video, I really harped on the importance of championships. And I even noted at the beginning that this video was more intended for the people that say championships should not be used in player rankings. But that's not the overall message I was trying to get across with this little video series. If you watched this whole video series, here's what I hope you, the viewer, took away. Being great isn't the same as being all-time great. Winning championships is nice, but being great is better. And then if you can be great and win championships, there's not much that can really top that. Now, if I was asked this question before doing these surveys with these people, I would have felt different. But after I got done talking to everybody, my opinion on that has definitely changed. Also, a player might need a championship to validate his or her stats, talent, and accolades, but a player might also need their championships to be validated by the stats, talent, and accolades. Then the Hall of Fame might actually be the number one validation for any athlete. Going into this, I thought a championship was the number one validation. Not all championships are equal, and then everything matters. Whether it be the eye test, how you interact with others, the stats, the accolades, the team success, the individual success, the championships, and everything in between. Of all that stuff I just listed, you need to figure out what you value the most, be it in your own personal life or when you do player rankings. To close this little video series out, I'm going to show you my favorite final words from these participants. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, context matters. Context matters. Film matters. Stats are awesome. Stats are awesome. However, they don't tell the whole story. They just tell, a very small portion of it. So the context in the film matters. Keep an open mind when you're talking about other people and other careers, because chances are there's stuff that happened that you didn't know about.
It's all the accolades and stats, are cool, and even for the championship rings. But for me, the best way to remember a player though is sometimes the impact that they had.
Like, championships matter, but the parts around you matter the most. And when it comes to winning championships, if there's anything that you're taking away from this conversation, I hope that's what you're taking away from it.
I think of it as the eye test is super important, and also what players of that generation are saying about them, So like when you talk, or if you ever watch the top 100, the things they say about the players that year is just very interesting to watch. You know, some of these guys, they're like, dude, I've never seen anyone compete like this guy did in this game. It was crazy, you know, or like this guy's like Aaron Donald, you know, when people talk about Aaron Donald, they're like, yeah, you have to triple team him or else he's going to get to quarterback and he's going to disrupt the game. You know, I've seen this man literally manhandle people, like throw 300-pound men to the floor. And it's just, you know, like you can't show that in the stats. You can't show that in a Super Bowl ring, you know? And so it's hard because there's that, there's the generational difference, there's the fact that there's coaching, there's the fact that, you know, like what if there was injuries in that year, you know, even though you're making a Super Bowl run, there's so many factors that go into play. And so you have to really go with the player.
I guess I'll just say that, like, I think sometimes we value championships too much because we're valuing a team thing for a individual player. I think but the reality is it does vary sport to sport to some degree, but I think we can acknowledge a single player's greatness and acknowledge a team's greatness. How come we never talk about how great a team was? It's always about the players getting the rings. It's the team that gets the rings.
Greatness is not determined by the trophy, right? There are a lot of great people we just will never know about in history that I've met in my own personal life that we will never know about. I knew a lady who was a foster parent, and she took in the worst of the worst children and gave them better opportunities and a better life, and nobody would know about her other than those people in that small group. She's not given no awards. She's never been given a Nobel Peace Prize or anything, but she's done more for a community than most people have done with more resources. Your greatness has never been decided by the trophy you get, but by how your impact of oneself affects so many others. When you go through and you look at sports and you're trying to figure out what makes a player great, why is Barry Sanders so great? Because what Barry Sanders did benefited everyone around him. It made everyone around him do things different. Why is people like Tom Brady great? Because everybody around him gonna have to elevate to meet his standard. His aura, his spirit, everything reeks and it cinches and smells of greatness. Those things come out. When you look at receivers and you say, oh, this receiver is great, it's because everything he do makes you forget the other people. When you're great at what you do, not only does the world take notice, but you take notice. And now you become your biggest competition. Because most people who are great are always trying to seek out ways to beat the greatest parts of themselves. It is the only time that they feel challenged. If nobody's going to be better than me, I got to be better than myself. To me, if you're trying to find out what makes a person great, ask yourself, what have you done for somebody else? And how was the impact that you left on that person felt? And if you can answer those questions honestly and say, I did this, I did that, and that person felt great, then damn it, you great. And now your greatness, whether you get the trophy or not, does not go unnoticed, it does not go unrecognized. Your greatness will be rewarded later down the line by so many people who will then tell your story. You will forever be cemented in this thing called world's history. And whether we try to forget you or want to act like you never existed, we can't. Because it's just a story that's too great to not tell.